Okay, welcome everyone. And our speaker today is Riddhipati Moshu, and I think many of us here know Riddhi. He's a faculty member at ICTS Bangalore. And today he'll tell us about his recent paper with Manan Bhatia and Shivchendu Ganguly. And the first talk will be about an introduction to Liouville quantum gravity, and then the second talk will be based on the paper. Okay, Riddhi?
All right, thanks. Right. Yeah, do you see the slide full screen now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah, it's always great to speak Bangalore Property Seminar. As I was just telling to some people that the title of the first talk is the beginner's introduction to the Liouville quantum gravity, and the beginner here is me. So I want to make that very clear at the outset. So my understanding of this rather deep topic is quite limited. So I want to tell you some things that I have tried to learn based on the perspective from someone who has some experience in working in models like first passage percolation and last passage percolation. So I'll try to share some of that geometric perspective. Okay, and another thing is that this talk, at least the first talk, will be completely non-technical. Meaning, of course, there will be no proofs, but also, as you will see, this topic is quite technical because just to define some of the associated objects requires a lot of effort, like the Liouville quantum gravity metric itself. So for the purpose of this talk, I will completely ignore some of the more technical, vision theoretic, cosmological issues like how to show certain objects are measurable, or like which topology is the convergence with respect to those kinds of questions. They are very important when you are trying to do things seriously, but hopefully, um, you know, for the geometric things I'm trying to talk about, those will not be so terribly important. Okay, so please feel free to interrupt me any time there is a question. Yeah, I might not see the chat, so you can just unmute yourself and ask a question if I don't see your message in chat. Okay, so let's start. So what is the Liouville quantum gravity? So if you ask a physicist, so this thing came actually was introduced in physics in the 80s. I'll say a little bit about that later. So it's a model for a random Riemannian manifold. A two-dimensional Riemannian manifold which is random. So it can be parameterized by say the complex plane, the upper half plane, or this sphere, something like that. So we will only restrict to things that are parameterized by the complex plane C. So informally, what it is, it's a random Riemannian manifold within quote, such that the area measure is proportional to say e to the gamma times. So gamma is a parameter. So gamma will be always a parameter. It's a not always real, but it's either a real or complex parameter. But I'll mention that, come to that later. But let's for now say gamma is a positive number, real positive number. So purportedly, a gamma LQG surface is a random Riemannian manifold such that the area measure is given by e to the gamma h times the Lebesgue measure on C, and the Riemannian metric tensor is given by e to the 2 psi h times the usual metric tensor dx square plus dy square on C. Okay, so here gamma is a parameter and psi is a function of gamma. And what is h? So h is the Gaussian free field on C. So if you most of you probably know what is the definition of a Gaussian free field on a continuum Gaussian free field on C, but if not, I will explain that in a couple of slides. So the first question is, what is the relationship between gamma and psi? So if you do a little bit of some back of the envelope calculation with scaling, you'll see that if this thing makes any sense, then the relation between psi and gamma should be that psi over gamma or gamma over psi rather, should be the dimension of the surface in some sense. So this is the usual relation between the length and the area. Okay, so what is the problem with defining this as a like proper Riemannian manifold? The problem is that the Gaussian free field is extremely rough. So you cannot really make sense of this as a smooth Riemannian manifold. But what you can still do is that you can make sense of various quantities associated with this surface, like the area measure or the metric or several other objects, several other natural objects associated with this random surface. Okay, so even those have been fairly challenging. You know, there's a lot of work, like last 15 years or so. There is a huge body of work which has been developed, mainly trying to rigorously define these objects or these particular objects associated with respect to this gamma LQG surface. Okay, so as I said, so gamma is a parameter and then psi is a function of gamma. So let's just say at the outset what these parameters are. So the usual parameter range, which is the subcritical parameters, so to speak, is that gamma is a positive real number between 0 and 2. And then psi, so it's a big open problem to actually know what exactly is psi as a function of gamma. But what is known is that psi is an increasing function of gamma on the parameter on the space on the interval 0 to 2. And then psi of 2, that there's some estimates for that, so it's approximately something like 0.41. So if you put psi equal to psi of 2 or psi bigger than psi of 2, so psi is always a positive real number. So if you put psi values outside the range given by psi equal to psi of gamma by this function, then okay, so there is, in some sense, those correspond to surfaces. So psi equal to psi of 2 corresponds to gamma equal to 2, and so that is the critical case. And psi equal to psi larger than this critical value psi of 2, they in some sense correspond to values of complex gamma which have absolute value 2. So those are in some sense the non-physical cases. I don't really understand those, and I'll not go into that case at all. So we'll only discuss the subcritical case where gamma will be a positive real number between 0 and 2, and psi will also be a positive real number which varies between 0 to this 0.41 of that threshold psi. So these are the parameter ranges.
So why are these called subcritical, critical, or supercritical?
Okay, so right, so as I will mention, so there will be a fundamental change. So you will see that there is a, so if you think of this metric, for example, for psi less than in the subcritical regime, it will induce the same topology as the Euclidean topology on C, and it will be actually biholder with respect to the Euclidean topology. For the critical one, it will still induce the Euclidean topology, but it will no longer be biholder. For supercritical, the topology will be completely different. So it will actually be, so the Hausdorff dimension of that surface will actually be infinite, and there will be singularities in the surface. So the nature of the surface changes quite drastically when you go from one regime to the other.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, there are probably better answers which I'm not entirely sure about. Yeah, so maybe someone like Atul can give a better answer, but I don't really know anything more than that. Okay, so just a little bit about history. So these were first considered by Polyakov in 1981, where his motivation came from string theory. So it is also connected to something called Liouville quantum field theory, which physicists say is like the easiest non-trivial quantum field theory. Again, I don't really know what those things mean. So the reason I put this slide in is that First of all, some of you in the audience might know what these things mean, and it might make sense to you, although it doesn't make that much sense to me. But and also, if you are interested, you kind of know which keywords to search for. Okay, so what physicists would say is that this Liouville quantum gravity surface is a uniform sample on the space of all Riemannian metric tensors, weighted by the determinant of the Laplacian power something. This is this minus Cm over 2, where they call this Cm to be the matter central charge, and this Laplacian is the Laplace Beltrami operator on that domain. And then so there is the relation between this matter central charge and the gamma parameter I was talking about is given by this relation. This is Cm equal to 25 minus 6q square, and q is a function of gamma. So if you translate from this gamma parameterization to this matter central charge parameterization, then the subcritical regime is minus infinity to 1, and supercritical regime is 1 to 25. So the original motivation of Polyakov that came from string theory, that corresponds to the case that matter central charge is equal to 25. And yeah, the matter central charge is equal to 0. That case is a particularly special one, which corresponds to gamma equal to square root 8 by 3, and that is very related to the theory of random planar maps. So so that's what I wanted to talk about next. So this is another sort of motivation, more probabilistic motivation maybe to study these kinds of surfaces. So suppose you have uniform planar triangulation on n vertices. So you take you consider a graph on n vertices. You consider n points on the plane, and you look at all possible triangulation. Choose one uniformly, and then it is known. Okay, so uniform, in the case of uniform planar triangulation, it is known actually that these converge to this LQG metric. Say if you look at the underlying graph metric, so they converge to LQG for this gamma equal to square root 8/3, which corresponds to the matter central charge being 0. So for other values of gamma being in 0 to 2 at least in the subcritical regime, so the gamma LQG is believed to be the scaling limit of planar maps, but no longer uniform planar maps. These are planar maps decorated with some statistical physics models. So for example, a planar map decorated with a spanning tree. So where each where the probability of choosing a configuration is proportional to the number of spanning trees it has. So that is believed to converge to the LQG for gamma equal to square root. So these are conjectures, as far as I know. These things are not really rigorously known. So there is a definition of gamma LQG between all 0 and 2, but the case that is planar maps converge to the corresponding gamma LQG, as far as I understand, it's known only in the case gamma equal to square root 8/3. Okay, so with that introduction, so let us try to make some rigorous definitions of what we are dealing with. So first we need to understand what is the Gaussian free wheel. So there are lots of ways to define Gaussian free field. You can define it by taking like limits of discrete Gaussian free field, but what would be more convenient for us is to define it as a random series. So you consider the set of all smooth functions on a domain. So let's consider a bounded domain in C. So you consider all compactly supported smooth functions and equip them with the Dirichlet norm. So you just look at the gradient square, integrate over the domain. Then it's these are fairly standard facts in PDEs. So if you look at the Hilbert space closure of this space of compactly supported smooth functions, then that is a separable Hilbert space. So you can so this is usually denoted by 801 of u. So So you can choose a countable orthonormal basis of that. So you fix an orthonormal basis, F1, F2 of this thing. And then formally you can define zero boundary Gaussian free field on U to be the random series given by summation xi fi, where xi's are IID normal 0, 1. Okay, so what is the problem? The problem is that this does not make sense as a random function. So you cannot define, so these limits are not almost really well defined. So the way one makes sense of these things is that instead of defining it as a random function on U, you define it as a random generalized function or a random distribution on U. So how do you define a distribution on U? You sort of define, so instead of defining the function pointwise, you define its integral against all possible smooth functions. That's how you define the distribution, right? So how does this work here? Sorry, just give me a second. Sorry. Do you still see my screen actually?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some Adobe update came, so I could not see my screen anymore. But okay, so it's working now. Okay, fine. So how do you define this action of H on these continuous functions on these smooth functions? So you define first that you first define the L2 inner product with respect to this Dirichlet norm, which is simply given by summation xi, and you take the inner product of fi and phi. So phi is a smooth function on U. So you define the Dirichlet inner product by the usual formula. So just write it. So xi would be the coefficients, and then so you get fi inner product with phi with respect to the Dirichlet norm. So this is easy to check that this is distributed as a centered Gaussian variable whose variance is the Dirichlet norm of phi, Dirichlet norm square of phi. And now you define the integral of H with respect to phi by simply looking at the Dirichlet inner product of H with the Laplacian inverse of phi. So Laplacian inverse is the inverse Laplacian with zero boundary condition. Okay, so this is how you define the action of H on any given smooth function, and this. So if you want to be a bit more technical about it, you can say that this defines a random element of the dual of CC infinity U. So the definition of H, so you can think of it as a random. You can think of it as a measure. So the law of the Gaussian free field, you can think of it as a measure on the space of duals, on the dual space of CC infinity U. So it's a measure on CC infinity U dual. Okay, so that's one way to define zero boundary GFF rigorously. So what is special about it? So one particular thing that is special about it is that it is conformally invariant. So if you have a domain U and a conformal map phi mapping U to V, then and H is a zero boundary Gaussian free field on V, then H composed with phi is a zero boundary GFF on U. So okay, I have to say how H composed with phi is defined. So you might think that H composed with phi will simply be defined as the action of H on phi composed with. So you take any like G, any smooth compactly supported function G on U, and then you define H of phi of G to be H, the action of H on phi of G. So that's not quite correct. I mean, that does not give this conformal invariance. You have to scale it by the Jacobian. So so there is a scaling involved, which is the absolute value of the derivative of phi square. But that's not particularly important. So that's how composition is defined in the space, so that the conformal invariance is there. Okay, so this is one of the particularly important properties of Gaussian free field. One of the reasons it's so important. And then, but so this is zero boundary Gaussian free field on a domain. So how do we define it on the whole plane? So one problem, as you can immediately see, is on the whole plane there are non-zero functions with zero Dirichlet energy, like constant functions. Right. So the Dirichlet energy, so the Dirichlet norm is actually not a norm on the Hilbert space, on the Hilbert space or on the whole complex plane. So the problem. So one way to get around this problem is that instead of trying to define H as an element of the dual itself, you try to define H as a dual as an element of the dual modulo constants. So that is one way to do it, and but to be more concrete, you can also just fix a constant function. So you can just fix a normalization and define H itself as an element of the dual. So the convention we will follow is the standard one. So we will make sense of H as an element of the dual itself with the normalization such that the integral of H with respect to the uniform measure on the circle, on the unit circle, is 0. Okay, so that will be denoted by average of H over T. So notice, so one thing one should point out here is that the uniform measure on the unit circle T is not an element of, it's not a smooth function on the whole plane. It's not a, so it is not an element of CC infinity of C. But that is not a problem. It actually turns out that you can define the action of H on the, actually you can define the action of H on any element of H minus 1. So I don't want to go into the function analytical technical issues there, but the main takeaway from here should be that you can define the integral of H against the uniform measure on the unit circle, and we just fix the normalization of H such that that integral is 0. And then the whole plane GFF makes actually makes sense with respect to makes sense as an element of the dual of the space of all compactly supported smooth functions on C. Okay, so but there is some price to pay, of course. So once you fix that normalization, once you fix this constant additive, once you fix this additive constant, then H no longer is conformally invariant. So the conformal invariance is there if you consider H as a modulo H modulo constants, but once you fix the constant, then the exact conformal invariance is destroyed. But you can still use the conformal invariance as a level of a generalized function modulo constants to get certain scaling properties of the whole plane GFF. So in particular, what will be particularly important to us is that is the following. So the Gaussian free field on the scaled space. So if you scale the space by R or 1 over R, depending on how you want to say it. So that is this H R dot. You look at the scaled GFF and you subtract off the average with respect to the circle of radius R. That has the same law as the original GFF itself. So that is a consequence of this conformal invariance at the level of generalized function modulo additive constants. Okay, so this is something that will be particularly important for us later. All right. So any questions so far before I say further?
Just one question.
Yes.
Why did you talk about constant functions? They are not in CC infinity anyway, right?
Yes, but we are looking at the Hilbert space closure, right?
Ah, I see. Okay.
So where CC infinity itself is not a Hilbert space, right? So
Right. Yeah.
so we have the Hilbert space closure. So this is that is one reason why you cannot make sense of this as an element itself.
Right. Okay.
So the modulo constants. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let's just say. So there are many interesting properties of Gaussian free fields, but I'm only going to focus on 2 because they will be important for us in the following talk. So the first thing is the domain Markov property of Gaussian free field. So what is right? So okay, so these are, so remember these things are distributions. So what I say will not make sense exactly rigorously, but essentially what it means is that suppose you look at the Gaussian free field on the whole plane Gaussian free field, and then you look at a domain U. Then the Gaussian free field, the law of the Gaussian free field restricted to U can be written as the sum of H1 and H2, where H1 is the harmonic extension of the boundary condition. So there is a, so suppose the domain also has smooth boundary. I think it works as long as the domain is Greenian, but let's just assume that the domain has nice smooth boundary. So what you are doing is that the effect of the Gaussian free field outside the domain U is felt via the boundary values, and the effect of the boundary values is exactly that you look at the harmonic extension of the boundary values to the interior of U. So that is H1, and the remaining part is just an independent zero boundary Gaussian free field on U itself. Okay, so this is the domain Markov. It's clear why it's called the Markov property, right? Because the effect of the outside onto the inside is just coming via the boundary, and the particular form of the dependence is that you just take the harmonic extension of the boundary condition, and then you and the remaining part is just a zero boundary GFF. So as I said, so because GFF is not a function, boundary condition does not make sense literally. So you have to make sense of it in the sense of distributions, but exactly how you are. Yeah, so it's not particularly important for us exactly how to define it rigorously. So just this heuristic understanding would be fine for us. And the second, yeah.
So this H is supposed to be the whole plane GFF restricted to U, is it?
Yes.
But
So,
that then the average condition won't be satisfied, right?
sorry again.
Is H the whole plane GFF restricted to U, the left hand side?
So H is the whole plane GFF with the boundary condition.
What boundary condition? Sorry.
With the normalization, not the boundary condition. With the normalization that the circle average is on the unit circle is 0.
But then the right side doesn't satisfy that, right? Or does it?
No, it will. So it just, so that thing will come from H1, right? So whatever this normalization is doing to H, that will be contained in, that information will be contained in H1.
I see. Okay.
So H2 is just a zero boundary GFF on U. So whatever this normalization, this additive, fixing the additive constant does on H, that is reflected purely within H1. So it's just an additive constant, right? So if you add a additive, if you just add a constant to a harmonic function, it still remains harmonic.
Right.
So if you just had a different additive constant, your H1 will also change by an additive constant. That's it.
Okay. So H1 has to be, made so that the average is 0 here.
Yes. So H1 is just the harmonic extension of the boundary condition, and the boundary condition is coming from H, which in itself contains the information that the average over the circle is 0. So you can also state domain Markov property for H defined without the normalization. So in that case, your H will be H1 plus H2, and H1 will be defined modulo an additive constant.
Okay.
So it's just that once you fix the additive constant on the side of H, it will also get fixed on the side of H1. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. I'm not fully clear. The H1 can be defined up to constant. I understand that. But the normalization for H, why it implies for H1, I don't see. But you can skip that point. I can ask you later. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I can try to explain it later. Okay. So anyway, so the second property that will be crucially important for us is that the average, if you look at this average process, so we have defined the integral of h with respect to these circles. So if you look at the average of h with respect to the circle of radius e to the t, and look at it as a function of t, so this will be a stochastic process in t. So that stochastic process turns out to be the standard two-sided Brownian motion. Okay, so as you can see, so if you put t equal to 0 by our normalization, it is just the Brownian, you get b0 equal to 0. So it is the standard, so you get this standard Brownian motion. So you get a two-sided Brownian motion. As t goes off to infinity, you get the positive side of the Brownian motion, and as t goes to 0, you get the negative side of the Brownian motion. Okay. So now coming to the issue of defining these area measure or the metric tensor, those kind of things. So what is the standard thing people use in analysis when you want to define these functions of distributions, or so the natural thing is to try a modification. So you take a modification instead of working with the distribution h itself, you take a modification of it, and then you send the modification parameter to 0 and try to see whether the limit makes sense in some sense. So that's exactly what is done here also. So what modification to consider? So there are a number of possible modifications that people have considered, but one of the most convenient one is to simply integrate it against the heat kernel. So for a fixed point z on the complex plane, you define the epsilon modification of h by just simply integrating against a density of integrating against a normal a Gaussian density with mean z and variance epsilon, or maybe 2 epsilon, something like that. So that's exactly what this is. So this is the modification of h epsilon. And as I said, there are other modifications also, but this is one of the standard ones considered in the literature. So once you have this modification, then to make the sense of the scaling limits, you need to renormalize. So okay, so let's first talk about the renormalization for the area measure, because that's much easier. So what you can do is that you can actually use the formula involving the Green's function to calculate what the expectation of this e to the gamma h epsilon z is. And that turns out to be approximately something epsilon to the minus gamma square over 2. So the natural thing, if you want to have a scaling limit, you just scale it back. So you get epsilon to the gamma square over 2 times this e to the gamma h epsilon z. So this will be your renormalized measure. And then one can show that for gamma is in 0 and 2, this mu h epsilon, this modified LQG area measures, they converge to a random measure on C, almost surely the randomness of H. Okay, so for each, so for almost every H, it converges to some mu H. So this limit is called the LQG area measure. It is a random measure on C. So this was done by Duplantier and Sheffield, and also by Rhodes and Vargas. Essentially, this is in some sense a special case of Kahane's theory of Gaussian multiplicative chaos. So this was one of the first major advances in this area about 10 years ago in this paper of Duplantier Sheffield, where they actually showed this limit exists and constructed the LQG area measure, and they also studied some properties of the measure itself, which I don't want to get into at this point. But the definition of the metric turned out to be much more complicated. The basic idea is the same. So you again do the modification, and then once you have the modified, so the modified field is a smooth field, right? So then you can define a proper metric. So you just take any path, piecewise continuous path, say, parameterize the path on 0, 1, and then you just integrate. So remember the metric tensor is supposed to be e to the psi h. So you just define the length of a path in the modified metric to be integral of this e to the psi h epsilon evaluated at pi t, and then you multiply it by the derivative of the absolute value of pi prime t. So this is the length of a particular path pi, and then you minimize over all paths pi. So this one can easily show that this actually is a metric. This is a nice metric. So then, but it kind of becomes much more unclear what to normalize it by. So eventually, this was this has been done actually quite recently, like over the last couple of years or so. So it was shown that there exists a family of constants A epsilon, which is like epsilon to the 1 minus this xi q. So remember there was this parameter q, which is 2 over gamma plus gamma. So this comes in here. So there is a family. So the particular form of the constant is not important for us, but the point is that there is a family of constants such that for all psi sufficiently small, all psi in the subcritical regime, if you look at the renormalized metric, where you scale this dh epsilon, the smooth metric dh epsilon by this factor a epsilon, almost not almost surely, maybe in probability it converges to a metric, a random metric dh. Okay, so this is and this dh will be called the LQG metric. So as I said, so there is a huge literature on this construction on the LQG metric. It took quite long, as you can see, from the measure construction in 2011 to the actual construction is like last year. So I'll not mention all the steps in the construction, but I want to point you to some of the main steps that were involved. So there is this paper by Jianding and Yuan Nguyen, which actually showed that this constant d gamma that actually exists. So remember what I said, that d gamma is the dimension of the metric space. So if you go by that definition, you first have to construct the metric space and then see that d gamma is the dimension. But no matter. So Ding and Nguyen, they showed that there are some other definitions of d gamma coming from some discrete approximation schemes that make sense, and they also obtained various estimates and monotonicity properties of psi and all. And then there was this crucial paper by Jianding, Julian Dubeda, Alex Dunlop, and Gopal Kone, where they showed that this scheme, this renormalization scheme that I described to you in the previous page, that actually is tight. So this renormalized matrix the sequence is tight. So there are in particular subsequential limits. And then there is this paper by Yuan Nguyen and Jason Miller, where uniqueness was established. The uniqueness of subsequential limits along with many other things. And in particular, after it has been established, they showed also that d gamma indeed is the Hausdorff dimension of the limiting metric space. So you get a limiting metric on C, and the d gamma is the almost sure Hausdorff dimension of that limiting metric space. Okay, so there are of course many more steps that were involved in this construction, which I don't really want to get into. So how am I doing with time actually? How much time is left for this first talk?
About 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So let me quickly go through some basic properties of LQG metric. I mean, if there's something is left over, then and if I need it for the second talk, I'll come back to it later. So one of the important things is that it is actually a length space. So what does length space mean? Length space means that your metric value is actually the infimum of length over all paths. So you define length by length of a rectifiable curve. You define it by approximating it by piecewise continuous functions, summing over the distances between each consecutive partition point, and then you take maximum over all possible partitions. So one can show that this LQG metric is actually almost surely a length metric. And then, as I said, so d gamma is the Hausdorff dimension. And then another important thing that will be important for us is that the metric is local, in the sense that if you look at the induced metric on any domain, any subdomain. So how do you define the induced metric? When you define the induced metric, you take the infimum over all paths contained in the domain instead of taking infimum over all paths. So one can show that this induced metric actually is a function of the Gaussian free field only restricted to U itself. So this internal metric DH restricted to U is determined by the restriction of H to U. And then, as I already mentioned before, that this induces the Euclidean topology and is bipolar with respect to the Euclidean metric. There are quantitative estimates available which were important for us, but I don't want to go into that talk. So there are some other scaling relations that will be important for us. So okay, so one other thing is that you can define. So I defined everything for the Gaussian free field, but it turns out that you can also define the same approximation scheme and the same scaling elements. You can define for a Gaussian free field plus a continuous function. So you can define this limiting LQG metric for a field which is the Gaussian free field plus a continuous function. And then you can relate. So this is the thing called a Weyl scaling formula. So if you look at the metric for the field H plus F, that is simply the metric. So then you have this metric DH, and then it's as if you are putting a weight e to the psi f on the underlying metric space DH, and then you are integrating against that weight function, the length of all paths. So you get that the metric you get by doing that is the same as d of H plus F. And then there is a translation invariance, which is not particularly surprising. And then because the GFF modulo these additive constants is the translation invariance. So okay, and then there is another thing which will be important for us is the coordinate change formula. So what I have written here is only a special case of the coordinate change formula, but what you can see is that, so if you look at the GFF with the R scaling, so instead of H of Z, if you look at the H of RZ, if you look at the LQG metric corresponding to that, and then you consider the LQG distance between RZ and RW in that field, then what you get is the scaled version. The scaling factor is R to the psi Q. So Q is the function of gamma as before, times the LQG distance between Z and W in the original DH metric. Okay, so this is there's no need to pay too much attention to this at this time, but what is important to remember is that such scaling relations are there, which will be important in some of our choices in the next talk. So the final thing I wanted to mention is about the geodesics. So what is known about the geodesics? So these things were developed in a number of works. In particular, the work from last year by Gwen, Joshua Pfeiffer, and Scott Sheffield. So I have summarized the basic findings is that almost surely for any 2 points there is a geodesic. If you fix the endpoints, the geodesic is almost surely unique. So we'll always consider geodesics parameterized by the LQG distance. So for each point in the plane, almost surely there exists only a unique infinite geodesic started from that point. So there exists an infinite geodesic, and the infinite geodesic is unique. So this will be important for us. I'll explain in the second talk why the infinite geodesic should be unique. So this is very different from what you see in the FPP or LPP models. And then the geodesic is also scale invariant in the sense that if you look at the field together with the geodesic, then that has the same law as the scaled field with proper centering and the scaled geodesic with proper normalization. So this the exact formulas are not of importance to us, but it is scale invariant in this sense that is important. And also it is known that there are no bigeodesics. Bigeodesics meaning by infinite path, says that every finite segment of that is a geodesic. So almost surely there are no such by infinite paths. Okay, so So shall I stop here, or can I take a couple of more minutes? I mean, these things will be important for the next talk, so I can push it.
Sure, you can take 5 more minutes. We're
Okay.
3:16, so.
Okay, so anyway, so let's just see some other properties of the geodesic which would be particularly relevant for our talk. So if you are familiar with the standard literature of first and last passage calculation, which are I'll talk a bit more about those in the next talk. So these sort of results will be very familiar to you. So what happens in smooth Riemannian manifold? So look at the Euclidean space. You take 2 points, 3 points A, B, C. You look at the geodesic from A to C and B to C. So unless B is on the same straight line joining A and C, these geodesics will never meet, right? The geodesics will meet only at this common endpoint. So for the random metrics, like in the same happens in the first and last passage populations, that doesn't happen. So the geodesics actually coalesce before getting to the same endpoints. Unlike what happens in the smooth Riemannian metrics. So what is the formulation of the result? So you fix Z, say Z equal to 0. And then if you take 2 points that are sufficiently far from from 0 in the LQG distance, say outside the S ball. So by the way, I should mention that the balls don't look anywhere such nice. So the balls usually will have many holes inside and all, but this is just for illustration purposes. So you take 2 points Z and W which are sufficiently far from 0, and then consider the geodesics. Then given any S, there will be a T such that the two geodesics will coincide in the T ball around 0. So they'll spend at least some time together before hitting the common endpoint. Okay, so this is of particular importance. And then something even stronger holds is that so if you look at the geodesics across annuli, so you take an annulus whose inner circle has radius r and outer circle has radius say k times r, then there is a positive probability such that every geodesic going across this annulus actually passes through the same point. So there is a common point among all the geodesics going across this annulus. Okay, so this is actually the reason why there will be unique infinite geodesics, because there are at every scale there is a positive probability. So eventually there cannot be two disjoint infinite geodesics. Okay, so that's So I guess I'll stop here. But as I said, that there are many similar results for critical and supercritical LQG metrics which are developed very recently. So there is a sequence of papers by Jianding and Yuan Nguyen, where many of these the constructions for supercritical and critical LQG metrics are also done, and similar properties like coalescence of geodesics and things are also proved. But yeah, as I don't really want to get into that. But yeah, so these are kind of some of the standard references for this field. So there is an extremely nice set of lecture notes by Nathaniel Berishtiki. Now I guess this is being turned into a book by Berishtiki and Powell, which does things very clearly. And then there is this. There are 2 surveys, one by Gwen Holden and Son, that gives more about these planar map stuffs. And then there is this very recent survey which is going to be part of the ICM proceedings by Ding, Dubeda, and Gwen, which talks in more detail about the LQG metric. So in particular, what I have talked about, most of the stuff you can find, at least the statements, like concise statements, you can find in this survey by Ding, Dubeda, and Gwen. Yeah, okay. So that's where I stop, and yeah, so you can take questions now.
Yeah, I have just one question.
Yeah.
So you have defined a random metric on C, right?
Yes.
So does it make sense if you take 2 points Z and W?
Yes.
Expected distance between the 2 points?
Yes, it does. So it is, it grows as some. So as I said, this is Holder with respect to the Euclidean metric. So it grows as, so if you look at the expected distance between 0 and R, it grows as some power of R.
Oh, but there is no formula for the distance ZW, sorry, is it?
Sorry, again, can you?
There is no formula for the distance between Z and W in terms of gamma, is it?
Yes, so this power is actually, so I said that this expected distance is r power r to the some power, right? And that power is a function of gamma.
I see.
So this so there is a distance exponent, and the exponent changes as you change gamma from 0 to 2. So that is the scaling that I mentioned, right? So this I maybe have this step. Yes. So
I see.
so this scaling here. So you see here.
Right.
So this scaling gives you this particular exponent. So you know, you fix 2 points Z and W, say 0 and 1, then the distance is just a unit order object.
Yeah.
Then you get the asymptotic of the distance between 2 points as they go far and far away by this scaling relation.
I see. But what I'm asking is, there is no explicit formula.
No. There is no explicit formula. So that is one of the major open questions about what is, can you, so if you know, if this model in some sense is integrable, can you find actually an explicit formula in terms of gamma?
I see. Yeah.
What is, so, but that I think is it even known for gamma equal to square root 8/3? Maybe Shanchandra, you can say. So, is there any explicit formula even in the square root 8/3 case?
That would be the Brownian map, is it?
Yeah, but yeah. So, is there any sort of explicit formula for the Brownian map? I mean,
Yeah, for the 2-point function, I mean, you can the 2-point function in the Brownian map is known. Yeah.
It is, so there is, I mean, known in the sense that there is a formula, or do you have some?
You mean, is there a density or that kind of thing?
Yeah, that sort of thing. Is that, do you actually have a density or something like that? Like,
Okay, I have to check that. Yeah.
Explicitly known.
It may be. I have to check that. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So yeah. So this for the special case gamma equal to square root 8/3. A lot of things are known. I'm not exactly sure what all the things are. So one thing is known is that the value of so xi and q, those things are explicitly known only for gamma equal to square root 8/3. So if you put gamma equal to square root 8/3, you know that d gamma is 4. So this comes from the fact that if you look at a uniform random planar map on n vertices, the diameter of that graph is n to the 1/4. So the Hausdorff dimension in that case is 4. So you explicitly know what is the form of xi in that case. So xi would be square root 8/3 divided by 4. So you know this exponent that I wrote, the distance exponent, that is explicitly known in the case square root 8 gamma equal to square root 8/3. It's possible that something more is also known, but I'm not really familiar with the uniform random planar map literature, so I don't know. But a lot of things are known there, which is not known for any other values of gamma.
I see. Okay.
I have one question. So is the area measure mu h a function of dh?
Yes. So okay. So okay. So right. So it is known that So it is separately known that h and mu h, they determine each other, and h and dh, they determine each other.
Sorry, what was the second one?
So the field. So there is a field measure correspondence. So h and mu h, they determine each other.
Okay.
And h and dh, they determine each other. That is also known.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That will tell you that mu h and dh also determine each other.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is, well, okay. So maybe there is some caveats there. So maybe it is known only if you fix a bounded set or something like that. So there some version of this thing is known, but it's yeah. So I'm not 100% sure what exactly the rigorous statement is. I have to look it up. But
my intent in asking was, I mean, in moving from the Riemannian metric to the metric, it's only a conformal metric, still to this distance function.
yeah,
Are you losing something? Is there something finer which is expected to converge, or
okay, yes. So that yes, so that is, I guess, yes. So that part is not completely clear. So you know, in some sense you expect the whole surface to converge, right? So you in some sense expect, so you do this, say this random planar map. So you get a random surface,
okay?
and then this whole thing is supposed to converge to something, you know, which has the area measure as the LQG measure and the metric as the LQG metric.
Uh-huh.
But so from what I understand, this, at least for general gamma, the existence of these limits are done for separate statistics separately. So yeah, so whether or not there is this grand thing is known is not clear to me.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can start the second talk. Yeah.
All right, so let me just share. Yeah, do you see my slides now?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So as I mentioned before, so the second talk will be a recent project that I did with Manan Bhatia, who's currently at MIT, who was at ISC and ICTS before, and Shishendu Ganguly from Berkeley. So this is a project on the environment seen from the infinite geodesics in quantum gravity. So as I was saying, so I am my experience is more on working with more classical random growth models on the plane, like first and last passage population, and somehow this question is motivated also from those fields. So what I'll do is I'll start with a digression about those models, and then try to motivate why we looked at the particular problem that we did. So just for a quick recap, although most of you are familiar with this model. So what are first and last passage population models on the Euclidean lattices? So first passage population on ZD, say, will, or if you want, you can just fix D equal to 2. So you just put random weights, IID positive weights on the edges of the lattice, and then you look at the random metric. So remember, we are also considering random metrics, right? So here in the setup in the last talk. So here also we are considering random metrics, but the underlying driving noise is no longer exponential of a Gaussian free field. It's just a IID white noise. Okay, so we have positive IID noises on the edges, and then the metric you get is simply just you look at any path in the graph, you sum the weights along the path, you minimize overall possible paths, you get your metric. Well, it might be a pseudo metric if you're allowing 0 values, but let's say we only allow positive. Okay, so this is another model of random metric. This is called the first passage population model. And then there is also the last passage population model, which will not give you a metric, but will give you what we can call an anti-metric. So the opposite of the triangle inequality will be true. So what is the model? I only restrict to one specific case here because yeah, that will be of interest to us. So this is the exponential last passage population model on the plane. So instead of on the edges, you put vertices on the weights on the vertices, and then instead of, so you define the weights of paths in the same way, but now the distance, well, it's no longer a distance because it does not satisfy triangle inequality, but the last passage time between two vertices is the maximum weight of a path. Well, to make sense of the maximum weight of a path, we need to restrict the paths. We cannot just allow infinitely many winding paths. So we will only consider vertices, pairs of vertices which are ordered coordinate wise, and will only consider upright paths between them. And the last passage time will be defined as the maximum weight of a path connecting two vertices. Okay, so this is the last passage population on the plane. So you can also define last passage population in general dimension, but we'll also only be interested in dimension 2, and in particular we'll be interested in the exponential last passage population case where the weights are IID exponential. Okay, so these models are these planar models for first and last passage population models. They're believed to be in the same universality class, the so-called Kardar-Parikshit-Yang universality class. It's been conjectured for a long time, but this is not rigorously known for any generic class of models. There are only a handful of models which are called integrable or exactly solvable, for which you can have explicit formula for the distance, and you can do calculation using those formulas to actually show that they rigorously show that they belong to this predicted KP universality class. So one of the reason I included exponential last passage population here is because one of the exactly solvable models of last passage population for which you know that it is rigorously in the KP universality class is the exponential last passage population. There are a number of other handful of other examples for which it is known, and there is also it's also believed that there's also a universal scaling limit. So after you do the speed, so you can, so these are planar models of random growth, in the sense that if you look at the set of all vertices which is within a certain distance of the origin, and then increase that distance, then it's a model of random growth, and the boundary of this growing cluster, it gives you a random interface. So after you do a proper space-time scaling of this growing random interface, it's supposed to converge to a universal object, and so the universal object is sometimes referred to as a directed landscape. So there are some very exciting recent progress in this area where the existence of the directed landscape is proved, starting with some exactly solvable last passage population model. So anyway, so the point is that these are models of random metrics, metric within quote, because last passage population is not exactly a metric, but it behaves locally as one. So there are these other very well studied models of random metrics on the plane, and their scaling limits in some sense. So many people have looked at many different things in these models. So in particular, how I got to learn of this type of questions was from Chris Hoffman in 2015. It was 6-7 years ago. So what was Chris asking? So you look at the geodesic, so geodesics are the optimizing paths, right? So if your underlying variables are continuous, there will be a unique optimizing path always. So what you want to understand is that how does the geodesic, okay, so the first thing is that a point on the geodesic is not a typical point. So if you pick a typical point, you know what exactly its distribution is. It's IID from whatever law you chose from. But if I tell you that this particular point lies on the geodesic, then that's giving you some extra information. So in the first passage population model, you expect that a geodesic will only pass through points that are in some sense lower value, have lower weight than typical. And similarly, in the last passage population model, geodesics are supposed to pass through mostly points which have higher value than typical. So in some sense, the information that a point lies on the geodesic tells you something about that the point or its random weight. So what Chris was asking is that suppose I pick a random point on the geodesic, and now I translate my environment so that this new random point is my origin. So it should no longer look, so the environment I see around the origin is IID. But once I have rooted on this random point, the environment that I see is no longer IID. Right? Or at least it should not be. So what is a question of interest? There are several reasons for interest in it, which I don't want to go into, but it is of interest to understand what happens. So if I look at a typical point on the geodesic rather than a typical point, what does the environment around it look like? So this was the thing that Chris wanted to understand. So let's make things slightly more concrete. So consider the first passage population on ZD with some nice enough passage time distribution. Let gamma n denote the geodesic between the origin and say n times u1. So u1 is the standard unit vector, the first unit vector. Now you look at the environment. So for any point V in ZD, you look at the environment which is rooted at V, which you call that omega V. And then what you want to understand, so there is a typo here. So this should really be delta of omega V. So this is not omega V. So omega V is the environment rooted at V. And then what you want to do is that you want to understand the empirical measure on environments. So you cycle through all the points on the geodesic, and then you look at the empirical average of the environments you see. So this omega V should really be like a delta mass on omega V. So you get a measure on the space of all environments, which is given by the average, which is like 1 over the size of the geodesic, and you sum over all the vertices on the geodesic, put a point mass on the environment that you see around that point. So a basic question in the vein of what Chris was trying to understand is that how does this mu n look like? And in particular, as n becomes large, does it converge to something? Almost surely. So remember, so these are all functions of the original environment. So what we want to understand is that for almost sure starting original configuration, will these empirical measures converge to some measure on environments? Okay, so that is the basic question. So the objective of this project that I'm going to talk about is to formulate and answer the same question in the LQD setup. But before that, let us say a little bit about what progress has been made in this question since 2015. Not much actually in the most general form of the question that Chris asked, but also significant in some senses. So for the first passage population model, there is a result by Eric Betts, where Eric showed that, so instead of considering the whole environment around the geodesic, Eric was only considering the particular value on the geodesic. So you just look at the weight of the particular variable that you see on the geodesic. So Eric showed that empirical average will have a limit for most passage time distribution. So remember, you can think of these empirical averages as functions of the possible limits or subsequential limits of these empirical averages. They only depend on, if the limit exists, they only depend on if the limit exists and is the law of the limit is deterministic. And so they only depend on the underlying passage time distributions. So what Eric showed is that for certain notions of denseness, the class of underlying passage time distributions, underlying edge weight distributions for which this limit exists is dense for various notions of denseness. So in some sense, he showed that the answer to Chris's question, at least the variant of it he's considering, is typically true. So his arguments were based on some abstract convex analysis. So to put it very simply, it's a crossover simplification of what he did, is that essentially his result uses the fact that a convex function is almost everywhere differentiable. So, or variants of similar results. So using these type of results from convex analysis, he was able to show that for a typical passage time distribution, the answer to Chris's question is yes. although because his model, his arguments are more like convex analytic and ergodic theoretic, his results do not give any kind of quantitative estimates. But there was a later work by Zhang Yiyan and Lam and Chen, where they showed that this limit law. So if this limit law exists, so again they're all still considering only the point on the geodesic itself. So they showed that if the limit law exists, then the limit law must be absolutely continuous with respect to the actual law. So there is some law of some point in the space of distribution. So you're choosing some IRD law for the edge weights, and then you know that under some assumptions on some class of distributions, there is a almost sure limit of a law of the typical point of the weight of the typical point on the geodesic, and then this law of the typical point on the geodesic must be absolutely continuous with respect to the original law. So this is what this result by Zhang and Lam and Chen shows. The progress in some sense has been much more satisfactory as it tends to be for exactly solvable models of last passage population. So if you consider this exponential last passage population model that I mentioned, this is a recent work by James Martin, Alan Sly, and Ling-Fu Zhang. They actually answer Huffman's question in full generality, but in the context of just the planar exponential last passage population model. So what they show is that if you look at the geodesic, so if you look at the geodesic from the origin to the point n, n in the plane, in the exponential LP background, then and look at pick a uniform random point on the geodesic and you look at its environment, then the environment converges almost surely as n goes to infinity. And the way they did it is they exploited the exactly solvable nature of the exponential last passage population, and they used connections to totally asymmetric simple expression process, which gives a correspondence between infinite geodesics and second class particles. So infinite geodesics in the LP picture and the second class particles in the interacting particle systems picture. And using this, they could actually do explicit computations in the limiting environment. So in some sense, you can say that they have an explicit description of the limit law in this setup. So there is another result of in the exact solvable setting, but here in the scaling limit, as I said, this directed landscape, which is a scaling limit of exactly solvable last passage population model. So I don't want to get into the details of the scaling, but I just want to mention that after you have done the proper scaling, the geodesic, this case that is being considered by Martin, Sly, and Zhang, that the geodesic is from the origin to the point n, n. So once you have done the proper space-time scaling in the directed landscape, that is simply the geodesic from 0, 0 to 0, 1. So this is the geodesic between the point 0 in space between times 0 and time 1. So this was considered by in a paper last year by Duncan Dewan, Shorov-Sharkar, and Balint-Virag, and they actually again explicitly calculated the local limit. So if you fix a point on the geodesic at a given height, they could calculate what exactly. So you look at the environment around the geodesic, and you scale the environment properly and make the radius of the environment go to 0. So you look at the local limit of the environment around the geodesic. So they again could characterize what exactly is the local limit. It turns out to be a so the limit is also a directed landscape, but now with a different boundary condition. What is they refer as a Brownian Bessel boundary condition. So you have a Brownian motion and a Bessel process, and your boundary condition is given by like B1 plus B2 and B1 minus B2 if B1 and B2 are Brownian motion and an independent Bessel process. But anyway, so the point again is that there is an explicit description of the limit law. So of course, these being exactly solvable models, they have a lot more tools to analyze these models, and they use these specific tools. But at the core of both of these arguments, the argument of the Martin, Sly, Zhang paper and the Dewan, Sharkar, Virag paper, is an understanding about the coalescence of geodesics. So both of these results in particular hinges on understanding the structure of the coalescence of geodesics. In particular, if you start to geodesics from nearby points, how long does it take, and go off to a third far away point, how long does it take for the geodesics to coalesce, and those kind of things. Okay. So our objective in some sense was to understand the local geometry of the LQG metric space is very different from the local geometry of these FPP and LPP metric spaces. And so in particular, for example, the geodesics in the LQG setup, they tend to wind a lot, which results in there is being only a unique infinite geodesic in starting from a given point, whereas in the FPP models, or well, it's not rigorously known in the FPP model, but let's say the exponential models, there is a unique infinite geodesic in every possible direction. So the local behavior is quite different. So in some sense, our objective was to try and understand sort of what kind of geometric information, because of, as I said, this understanding of this coalescence properties were also particularly interesting in the LQG setup. In particular, the final result of showing the uniqueness of the scaling limit for the LQG metric, that crucially dependent on understanding this coalescence of geodesics. So one of our objective in trying to understand this question was to see what sort of consequences of these coalescence type results we can we derive from in the LQG setup in reference to questions that are already being looked at in the other class of more classical planar random metric models. Okay, so this is what we were trying to do. By the way, there is one thing which I should probably mention. I keep saying this coalescence of geodesics because I come from more of this FPP LPP background. But if you talk to someone in the literature, in the LQG side or the random planar map side of things, they'll refer to this sort of geometric properties as confluence of geodesics, because that's what Legal termed it when he proved such results in the case of random planar maps, or maybe the Brownian map. So, if you are more familiar with the confluence term, I apologize, because yeah, that's sort of more standard in this literature. But because my background is more on the FPP side, I tend to say coalescence more. Okay, so back to the question at hand. So what we are trying to do is that we're trying to formulate and investigate the question of understanding the environment around a typical point in the LQG setup. So we fix the unique infinite geodesic, almost surely unique infinite geodesic starting from 0. So this will always be parameterized by the LQG length, as I mentioned in the last talk. So what we want to do is, when we want to choose a random point on the geodesic, so we want to fix an initial segment on the geodesic, and then pick a random point. Whether or not the random point should be uniform here is something we'll think about in the next slide. But we'll choose randomly a point on an initial segment on the geodesic and look at its environment, look at the local environment around that geodesic. And then we want to investigate, as the endpoint of this segment goes off to infinity, does there exist a meaningful way to take a limit of these environments? That's our objective. So what are we trying to do? More specifically, we are looking at a point on the infinite geodesic. We are looking at a ball around that point. And then we will scale that ball. So, the radius of this ball will actually, because of the scaling properties of the GFF, the radius of this ball will not be the same everywhere. But what we will do is that we'll scale all these possible balls to the back to the unit ball, respecting the scaling of the GFF. And then at the end, we will end up with a metric with a distribution on the unit ball together with an induced metric. And we want to know whether the limit exists. So what exactly should the scaling for these balls be? That is the first question. So remember that we had this the underlying field in the LQG setup is e to the gamma of h, and h is in some sense translation invariant modulo this additive constant. So in some sense, the underlying noise field is invariant modulo rescaling. So there is no rescaling in the IID setup, in the white noise setup, right? Because everywhere it just looks the same. But that is no longer true in LQG because there's a rescaling involved. And which leads to, so these are the, I just want to remind you of the basic scaling of the field, the metric and the geodesic. So this kind of suggests that if we want to sort of have a natural analog of the question in the FPP setup, we should not be looking at the radius, the same radius environment around each point, because the geodesic scales like this. So the natural way to do it would be to, if you look at a point on the geodesic, which is at distance r from the origin, not LQG distance r, Euclidean distance r, because the scaling of the GFF is with respect to the Euclidean distance, remember? So if you look at a point on the geodesic, so maybe I should just go ahead. Yes, so I'll come back to that, but maybe this picture should be here actually. So what we should do, so this is the geodesic. So the radius of the environment around the point on the geodesic should be proportional to its Euclidean distance from the origin. That's what the scaling of the geodesic suggests. So that's what we will do. So remember, remember this picture. I should have put this picture in the earlier slide. But this is exactly what we are doing. So there is a value delta we'll fix between 0 and 1, which is a technical thing, which is you should not worry about it too much. So what we will do, there is a complicated description which you can read if you want, but probably it is easier to understand what is going on just by thinking of that picture and listening to what I'm saying. So let's say delta equal to half. So then what we are doing, we are looking at a point on the geodesic whose distance is r from the origin. Then you look at a ball of radius r over 2 around it. And then we scale the environment, we scale that r over 2 radius ball to a unit ball. So we have now a random field on this unit ball, which we further center. So we subtract off an additive constant so that we make the random field have average 0 over the unit ball. So we end up by doing this complicated procedure, which is formally described in the slide. We end up with a random distribution on the unit ball whose integral along the boundary is 0. Okay, so that's what we're doing. So we are taking a point on the geodesic whose radius is r over. We're taking a point on the geodesic. We're taking whose Euclidean distance from the origin is r. We are taking an r over 2, which corresponds to delta being equal to half in this slide. So we're taking an r over 2 radius ball, exactly like here, and then we scale it together with the field restricted to this ball to a field which is a random distribution on the unit ball. Then we further do a centering to make sure that this random distribution on the unit ball that I have has integral against the boundary equal to 0. Okay, so is that clear? and then you define similarly the metric. So this ball, again, this ball, it has an induced metric, which is just, so because it's a point on the geodesic, things are different. But if I just had a deterministic ball somewhere, there is a induced metric which is a function only of the field restricted to that particular ball. Then again, once I rescale it to the unit ball, then the metric should be rescaled like this because of the metric scaling of the geodesic. These formulas are not important, but the point is that there is some rescaling which gives you a metric, and the metric and the so you have a unit ball together with a random distribution on it and a metric, both of which come from the random distribution and the induced metric on the original R/2 radius ball. Okay, so this is how we define a particular local environment. So this is, now I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but this is in some sense a natural way to define a local environment and a local metric on a neighborhood around the point on the geodesic. Okay, and then we have to choose. Then we have to now specify how exactly we are going to choose a random point on the geodesic. So again, in some sense, if you try to think of an analogy to the first passage percolation model, there is no scaling involved. Because there is no scaling involved, the contribution to the geodesic coming from all the scales are same in the classical first passage percolation scenario. But here, because this environment is some sense invariant only modulo rescaling, that means if we want the contribution to the geodesic coming from all scales to be the same, we should parameterize the geodesic by log. That in that sense, the contribution coming from 1 to 2 should be the contribution, the same order of the contribution coming from R2 to R, which is something that you expect any meaningful parameterization to have, because the geodesic, the GFF itself has that kind of scaling embedded within it. Okay, so that is the that sort of is a justification of the choice of the parameterization of the geodesic we make. So finally, what we are doing, so for any t bigger than 0, we take a uniform random point between 0 to t, and we look at the point on the geodesic which is at LQG distance e to the t, e to the capital T. So the capital T is a random variable uniformly on 0 to t. So we look at the point on the geodesic whose LQG distance from the origin is e to the capital T, and we look at the local environment and the metric on that environment. So the local environment, we'll just call it field T, and the local metric we'll call metric T. So what we want to understand at the end of the day, after all this complicated procedure, so think back to the question in the FPP setting. What we want to understand that for a given realization of H, so for a given realization of H, remember the randomness here comes only through this T, the capital T. So for a given realization of H, this field T is a random environment which is a function only of capital T. So what we want to understand that if almost surely in the realization of H, this field T and metric T, do they converge to something or not? That will be the analog of the question that Chris asked in the FPP setup. And the main theorem of our article is that indeed this is true. So again, for a fixed delta in 0 and 1, there is a random distribution on D, so which we call field, such that almost surely in the randomness of H, this field T converges in law to field, and there is a similar result which holds for metric T. Okay, so one thing I should mention that this parameter delta is a bit after rescaling, your environment should be an environment. So you do some rescaling what is necessary, but you should still get an environment on the whole plane. That is what ideally you would like. But it's an artifact of our proof that we cannot quite get that. So we can only get an environment of sufficiently small radius around the geodesic. So it's not quite the convergence of the full environment, but it's the convergence of some local environment and an induced symmetric on that. How much time do I have? Like 10 minutes?
Sure, you have 10, you can use 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So let's see. I mean, let's just try to explain a little on how. So what I want to explain mostly is that how the kind of geometric ideas, the geometric properties of the geodesics that I described in the previous talk.
Riddhi, before that, one question. Sorry.
Yes.
I mean, does joint convergence or something make sense here, or is it of interest?
Yes. So right. So we can actually show that this, there is a function that you can. So we can show that actually there is a coupling. Yes. So,
okay.
So as you will see that there is a, the argument is basically an argument, a renewal theoretic argument. So you can show that this the joint law is a size biased coupling of a law of a point chosen in an appropriate manner. So it's a size biased version of a joint law of a environment and a metric on a particularly chosen point. So yes, I mean, I'm not sure if it's of particular importance, but we can show that there is a coupling. Yes.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
So, okay. Right. So okay. So what is the basic idea? The basic idea is to find the renewal structure along the geodesic. So essentially, what we want to do again, so this all comes back to the basic heuristic of Chris, that if the underlying field is IID, then even though we are picking some random points, in some sense the environments they see around the points on the geodesic should also be approximately IID. So that's sort of the basic heuristic why you expect such a result to be true. So again, such a result should be true in our case modulo rescale. So what we want to do is we want to move across different scales, and we want to show that the contribution to the empirical measure provided by these different scales in some sense are approximately IID. Well, they will end up being a stationary sequence with exponential decay of correlation, so that we can use a strong law of large numbers. That's essentially. So it's not quite a renewal process because we don't have IID increments, but it's a renewal-like structure, so that you have stationary increments with sufficiently fast decay of correlations. So how does one go about that? So you fix a K that is sufficiently large, and you divide the space into these concentric balls of radius K to the I. So now remember, there is this coalescence result across the annulus that I talked about, that there is a positive probability that this annulus of radius K to the I to the annulus of radius K to the I plus 1, that all geodesics coalesce between those annulus. So what one can show, okay, so of course these annuli will not be exactly independent, but one can show using the domain Markov property that far enough away, the effect of the, so if you look at two scales, I to I plus 1 and J to J plus 1, and J is sufficiently larger than I, then the effect of whatever is happening at scale I is, that will be propagated by whatever the harmonic function in the harmonic extension, and you can estimate so you can use some estimates on harmonic functions to see how fast they decay, and you can show that if J is sufficiently larger than I, the effect, the information coming from this fast scale I is not very significant at a large enough scale G. So using that, you can show that there exists a sequence of coalescence points. So there exists a sequence of J. Okay, so there is a sequence of I such that there is a coalescence point between K to the I and K to the I plus 1. So we can write down a sequence of coalescence points J such that it's a bi-infinite sequence. You can do it with an infinite sequence also, but it's nicer to do it with a bi-infinite sequence. So this is a sequence of coalescence points J such that Pj goes to infinity as you send J to infinity, and Pj goes to 0 as you send J to minus infinity. So there is a sequence of coalescence points going off to infinity in one direction and going off to 0 in one direction. And then you partition the geodesic between these coalescence points. So remember, the empirical average that we are looking at means integrating over the whole geodesic. So now we'll partition the contribution of this integral over the whole geodesic into the contribution coming from one Pj to the next Pj. So we'll partition the geodesic into segments gamma Pj to Pj plus 1 and write down the contribution in the empirical average as sum over J, the contribution of the segment gamma Pj to Pj plus 1. Okay, and then you use the domain Markov property. So as I said, so the key idea, as I already have mentioned, to show that the contributions coming from these segments form a stationary sequence with fast decay of correlations. So actually, you can show that they have an exponential decay of correlations. And then we'll use a strong law of large numbers for a stationary sequence with exponential decay of correlations, which will give you the almost sure convergence. Okay, so this is a bit technical, so let me just go through this quickly. So how exactly one goes about doing these things is that, so you look at the field restricted to, say, the annulus or outside the ball of radius k to the I. So let's call this field, after you center it properly, so you make the average over the boundary 0, and you scale it back to the domain which is complement of the unit ball. So let's call this field HI. So by the usual scaling properties of the GFF, these HI form a stationary sequence. And by using the domain Markov property, as I mentioned before, one can show that local observables of this sequence of fields HI, they have an exponential decay of correlations. So this requires some estimates using harmonic functions, but they're not too complicated. So what one can show that essentially the Radon-Nikodym derivative of the conditional law of Hj given Hi with respect to its unconditional law is close to 1 with high probability. So that will show that the decay of correlation is small. The decay of correlation is high. Okay, so this is how. So this essentially tells you the environment in which gamma Pj to Pj plus 1 lives, and the environment in which gamma Pi to Pi plus 1 lives. If J minus I is sufficiently large, these environments are largely independent. Okay, so that is one thing that we need, but that is not the only thing that we need, because remember, we also have a dependence coming from this log parameterization of the geodesic. So one actually needs to deal with that dependence also. And to this effect, what one does is that one shows. So you look at the. So if you look at Li is, let's say, the LQG distance between 0 and the ith coalescence point. Then what we can show is that the sequence log Li plus 1 minus log Li. So the log increment that you get from across a segment between two consecutive coalescence points, it is also a stationary sequence with exponential decay of correlations. So this requires slightly more convoluted computations, but the key idea here is that this Li you can write, or at least Li plus 1 minus Li, you can write in terms of the circle average process. So eventually it boils down to the, well, not only the circle average process, so you use what is called the decomposition of the GFF into the radial part, which is the circle average process, and the lateral part. The lateral part is an order 1 object. So eventually you can write down a formula which involves this Brownian terms and some order 1 terms, and then you can do some Brownian computations to show that these are this sequence also gives some exponential decay of correlations. So essentially what you get after combining all these things is that the contribution in the empirical average coming from the segment gamma Pj to Pj plus 1 is a stationary sequence with exponential decay of correlations, and then you just apply strong law of large numbers. Okay, so that's the existence of the limit. So the next question you should ask is that, okay, so you know that the limiting field exists, but what can you tell us about it? Well, not much, because of the way it is the existence is shown. Because in some sense it's a strong law of large numbers, so you don't really, I mean, you apply to each functional, you apply a strong law of large numbers, so you get a limiting value of the average of that functional with respect to the field, but we still can show some things. So in particular, we can show that the the naturally interesting question here is to understand how atypical is it, right? Because we know that the average the environment around the geodesic should somehow be different than typical. Okay, so to this effect we can say something. So in particular, we can show that the law of the environment is mutually singular with respect to the law of the GFF on the field on the unit ball. So it is not absolutely continuous, as is not probably not unexpected. But in some sense, the singularity only comes from the geodesic itself. I mean the region very close to the geodesic. In the following sense, that we can show that you fix a delta prime in 0 and 1, and then you look at the annulus, which is the unit ball minus the delta prime radius ball. So you fix a small delta prime less than 1, and then you delete that particular annulus from the unit ball. So you now get delete that particular smaller delta prime radius ball from the unit ball. So now you have an annulus of width 1 minus delta prime. If you consider the environment in that annulus and compare that with the GFF restricted to that annulus, then the environment on that annulus actually is absolutely continuous with respect to the GFF on that annulus. So the singularity in some sense is coming from the really the local neighborhood of the geodesic. So how long do I have actually? Yeah, so maybe I don't want to say too much about it. So there's so maybe I should just skip the idea of the proof of singularity. But let me just finish with some sort of interesting things that we still don't know how to do, but will be interesting to establish anyway. So of course, the first question is there any explicit description of the limiting field in the metric? Well, no, who knows? But well, if there is, of course, it will be nice to find. But what is sort of more, what is probably more hopeful in understanding is that instead of trying to understand the description of the limiting field and metric on a fixed size ball, what happens if you take the local limit again? You really zoom in onto the geodesic itself and then take the limit. Can you then say anything about the local limit of the environment around the origin? That will be something that is very interesting. In particular, that will give some insight on the singularity near 0. So these questions relate also to this other question, which is of interest in the broader LQG theory, is so one knows, for example, if you pick a point from the LQG measure, almost surely that point has thickness gamma. So this is the result, goes back to Duplantier and Sheffield. So if you look at the gamma LQG measure and then you pick a point, almost surely point from that measure, you get so the thickness. So there is a notion of thickness of Gaussian free field, which I don't really want to go into, but so in some sense that is atypical. So it is a gamma LQG measure is supported only on gamma thick points, which have Hausdorff dimension strictly less than 2. Well, I guess it's like 2 minus gamma square over 2 or something like that. So these are really atypical points. So in some sense, what we are looking at is a metric counterpart of the same question. So, can you say something like a typical point on the geodesic has some typical thickness? Is there something that you can say? So there are similar results in the literature about points on the boundary of the metric ball. So there are, but for this particular question, there does not seem to have any. There does not seem to be even any sort of specific conjectures on what should be the thickness of a typical point in the geodesic field. So yeah, so these are some of the interesting things along the lines of what we were investigating. But yeah, so I guess I'll stop now, and yeah, thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Riddhi. Any questions for Riddhi?
Riddhi, one thing, again, it's somewhat tied up to the one I asked before. So, since you said earlier, if I remember, that the metric and also even the measure are, once you know the field, you know both of them. Is that?
I mean, it depends. I mean, the thing is that it's not completely clear what do you mean you know both of them, right? Because these are not really, the field is not a function. So this is defined in terms of some measurability criteria. So the metric is measurable with respect to the same sigma algebra as the generated by the field. This sort of. So it's not, it's hard to. Because these are not functions, kind of the usual intuitions don't always work. Like, what exactly it means to say that once you know the field, you know the metric. It's not quite as straightforward as it would be if the field was actually a genuine function.
Okay.
Things are a bit complicated there. Yes, so there is some formulation in terms of whether they generate the same sigma algebra or not. These kind of things. So when I say that it is known, I say that in that sense. So
Yeah. Okay.
To sort of characterize, it's not like I input you. It's not a function, right? That I can just input a field and get a.
But does it also mean now that actually, I mean, even at the very heuristic level, that you talk about the field and the metric when you look at the environment, but is there something about also the measure locally or something?
Yeah. So okay, so this is something we did not write down because it will be the paper is already quite long. But yes, so the same arguments that we did would also show that the local L3G measure around the points on the geodesic is with the proper scaling, they also converge almost to the same.
Okay.
So this the main idea is this decomposition, this approximately renewal structure. That you have for all these observables, field, metric, and the measure will also be there. It's just that so we did not write it up in the paper, but yeah, so it's the same.
Okay.
For the measure also empirical convergence of the
Okay, thanks.
I have one question about that result that you had about the absolute continuity and singularity.
Yes.
You looked at an annulus around the point, right? So it's not really away from the geodesic. So
well, away from not the geodesic, but away from the root of the geodesic.
True, but for example, in this, you always have the property that the delta at the annulus has a crossing by two geodesics, right? I mean, so
yes, but see, so maybe I should explain why the absolute. So the crossing by two geodesics is fine. So
is that true of the original also? Is my question.
Yes. Okay. So right. So this is the part we did not do. So what happens is that we showed that the absolute continuity of the limiting object with respect to the original. We did not.
No, it's not mutual. It's not mutual.
But the mutual is not true actually. So we did not prove it, but the mutual is not true precisely because of the reason that you are saying.
Okay. Yeah, though that confused me. Okay.
Yeah. So the reason the mutual singularity is true is because there is in the actual, in the limiting environment, there is a geodesic across the ball passing through zero,
Right.
which by the scale invariance, which is the same as the existence of a byte geodesic.
Uh-huh.
And one can show, using this kind of thing, that there are always a positive probability of at every scale to wind around the origin.
Uh-huh.
One can almost surely there will not be a geodesic passing through the origin.
I see.
So that's you can essentially, by using the kind of argument that you are giving, one can. So okay, so there are topological issues here which we did not check, but the is that one can show that the mutual absolute continuity, the in the other direction should not be.
Okay.
The mutual continuity is absolutely continuous with respect to the original, but the other direction should not be true for the reasons you are mentioning.
Okay.
The mutual singularity at the origin comes from that consideration itself.
Uh-huh. I see. Okay. Yeah, that was my question.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then